So welcome to my presentation. The title is Consciousness a Scalar? And I will try to attempt some answers to these questions using fMRI and computational modeling. What you see here is what the Shermans call a weather station, and this is a device that highlights the fact that apparently you need three numbers to specify the weather. So you need temperature, humidity, and pressure. And since some time I started asking myself then, how come that apparently we speak about consciousness using a single number when admittedly consciousness is a phenomenon that is perhaps way more complex than the weather. So how we measure consciousness is inspired in how we measure, for example, temperature. The idea is that we have a scale that is a single numerical scale, is in one dimension. And the same way we have a scale for temperature. Also, there are different possible scales. In the case of temperature, you have Celsius, you have Kelvin, and you have Fahrenheit and others. And in the case of consciousness, we also have different metrics that attempt to capture the level of consciousness. And then there is a reference state. In the case of temperatures, we usually use the absolute zero, and we tend to describe or to compare consciousness or different levels of consciousness with respect to ordinary conscious wakefulness. So an important question, I think, is why apparently one number is enough. So one number is apparently enough for neurologists, for example, when they order states of consciousness in one dimension. Here you have the level of arousal or vigilance, and here you have the level of awareness of consciousness. And apparently it's useful to organize these states in this one-dimensional line. And this happens not only for physiological states, such as the descent from wakefulness to deep sleep, but also for anesthesia of different dose or patients of different severity. Of course, this is not trivial that this has to be the case. There could be more dimensions, that could be different aspects of consciousness. Even from our own first-person point of view, it could be that it's not obvious that we should basically have one consciousness that is either on or off or changing between those extremes, but maybe we could have experiment a more multidimensional phenomenon. There are theories which are more complicated. We try to fit states of consciousness into a higher dimensional continuum, such as, for example, the AIM theory by Hobson and Schatz. But apparently, even if these theories describe states with more precision in neurobiological terms, they sort of come short of being useful in the practice. In the practice, neurologists will still fit a unidimensional scale to their brain-injured patients. And the same when a neurologist, for example, is interested in the depth of sleep. So one hypothesis for why apparently consciousness is usefully conceived as one-dimensional is that it is only practical to describe conscious states in this way, because brain activity is organized around a one-dimensional manifold as consciousness changes, in particular as consciousness is lost. So this means that there is, of course, a huge variability in the fluctuations of the brain. But if you factor out this variability, the variability that is not related to a level of consciousness, you will end up basically with a low dimensional characterization of the brain. And the idea is that in this low dimensional characterization of the brain, you start, for example, with wakefulness, and you move along some low dimensional line here towards the deepest states of unconsciousness. So what I'm going to show you, we tried to address this hypothesis using data from three different routes towards unconsciousness. So we consider data of humans during sleep, during early sleep, sleep of medium depth, and then deep sleep or slow wave sleep. Then we also have fMRI data of subjects under two different doses of propofol, so light sedation and loss of consciousness. And then we have data of patients brain injured patients of different severity. So patients in a minimally conscious state and patients who have unresponsive wakefulness syndrome. And the idea is to see if we can somehow compress the fMRI recordings into this line that summarizes loss of consciousness and whether these states fall into this line as expected. So to do this, it's difficult to directly apply a method to reduce the dimensionality or to find this manifold to empirical fMRI data, because the most powerful nonlinear methods, such as the case of autoencoders, for example, require lots of data. So in this paper, what we showed is that one can use whole brain modeling to augment the data and then use this data augmentation to generate samples for a variational autoencoder, which will represent fMRI data in a nice and organized way. The autoencoders are deep neural networks that take, for example, functional connectivity matrices as inputs, and then after going through a bottleneck of 2 units, in this case, they produce as outputs also functional connectivity matrices. And they are generative in the sense that if you put different numbers here, you will end up for each choice of numbers with different functional connectivity matrix. So this is basically the landscape of all the matrices you can get by changing these 2 numbers. So when you train these to reproduce these FC matrices that are produced by a model, you see above and below the diagonal the original and the reconstructed versions, and you see they're very similar. So this works very well to compress the data into 2 numbers. And if you plot different, in this case, states of sleep in this 2-dimensional space spanned by these 2 latent units, then you see that they fall into this nice, nice, almost 1-dimensional line here. So what's interesting about this is that you don't need all the data to train the autoencoder. You can only use, for example, wakefulness and deep sleep, and the other states fall nicely in the middle. So what we did here is a generalization of this article. So we fitted a whole brain model in which the local activity of each region connected by the ATI is given by Hopf bifurcation, and then we introduced some special heterogeneity in the model, meaning that different regions could have different bifurcation parameters depending on their membership to resting state networks. And then with this, we could fit these small parameters to optimally reproduce functional connectivity matrices obtained or measured during different brain states. And then using the autoencoder, we can encode then this data augmented space into these 2 latent space state units. And then another thing we did is that we showed that we could use external stimulation. So we could apply external periodic stimulation at the resonant frequency of each node to see if we could bring these dynamics away to this from this line, from this manifold. And basically what we did is we encoded the trajectory obtained after increasing the strength of the perturbation applied to the model. So these trajectories essentially what they show you is what will happen if we apply this form of stimulation to this state and we ramp up here the intensity. So the main result, first of all, is that using only 3 states, wakefulness, deep sleep, and unresponsive wakefulness syndrome, we can train the autoencoder, and then when we apply the autoencoder to the other states, this also falls nicely in between. So wakefulness, early sleep, deeper sleep, and then slow wave sleep. And then we also have then the anesthesia states and finally the patient. So this is as expected. And only using part of the data, we can find the expected relationship. And this is almost a unidimensional line. So what you see here is that we are not using in arbitrary way the latent space, but essentially if you move in this direction, what you are seeing is loss of consciousness. So here is the landscape of functional connectivity matrices and what happens as you move in this direction. This is again when you start here, and then this is the state of deepest unconsciousness. And what you see clearly is that FC is reduced as you move in this line, but that's not the only thing that happens actually. So we normalize this matrix, and show that, yes, of course, FC is reduced, but also there are other things happening when you factor the reduction in FC out. What you see here is that FC is reduced in some regions and is increasing a lot in others. And in the end, you end up with a network that is highly modular. So it's there is not really crosstalk between the models, or very little crosstalk, and then also that this network resembles a lot the structural connectivity matrix. So there is a collapse towards the structural connectivity, and networks become more modular and FC is reduced. So this is something that we can show because we have the latent space reproduction of the FC. So for each FC matrix, we can compute these metrics. We can compute, for example, the mean FC. So we start more or less here and we end up here. So obviously the mean FC is reduced when we go from wakefulness towards a responsive wakefulness syndrome. And then we have the same for modularity. There is an increase. There are some glitches here, but in essence, the trend is towards increasing modularity and also towards increasing similarity between functional and structural connectivity. So the first interim conclusion is that even training a variational autoencoder with only 3 states, we can make all the others fall into a curving latent space. And moving along this curve basically is characterizing brain activity in the transitions from wakefulness or conscious wakefulness towards deep unconsciousness. So briefly, the second part, the idea is to see, okay, so we have these low dimensional characterizations. What happens when we introduce perturbations into the brain, into the simulated brain activity? Can we somehow go away from this trajectory? And what is the meaning of that? So what I'm showing you here is what happens if you apply this periodic stimulation to one region in the parcellation that we use to build a model. And as you ramp up the intensity, basically you have this trajectory. So this is the scatter plot of general anesthesia with propofol, and this is for wakefulness. And you see that in this region, basically you go from anesthesia towards wakefulness, and here you recover an FC matrix that is typical of wakefulness. And this is what happens when you apply this to all other regions in the parcellation. You end up with a family of trajectories, and the line here is encoding the average of these trajectories. So what happens when we apply this to all these other states is that we have different displacements. But what I think is very interesting is that all of the displacements point more or less in the same direction. They all point towards wakefulness. Some of them are clearly giving a state that is really close to wakefulness. Like, for example, if you apply the perturbation here in anxious sleep, you end up here, which is really close. But even if you don't, what you see is that there is a general trend towards going in the right direction as we introduce this resonant periodic activity in the model. We can use different metrics to characterize what happens. For example, how far away from wakefulness you end after the perturbation is introduced, and how far away from when you started you end when the perturbation is introduced. And what we have is something we more or less expected. So as a function of depth of unconsciousness, this is increasing. So it's much harder to end up close to wakefulness if you start with the patients, and not so much if you start with light sleep. And there are some states in which you can very easily displace the activity away, like sleep, which makes sense because they are really unstable states, while there are other states, such as the brain injured patients, in which they're really stable. You cannot really go far away from when you started. And then what is confirmation of this result here, that they are going the same direction. Essentially, as we ramp up the perturbation strength, what you see is that the mean functional connectivity is increasing for all states, but also the modularity is decreasing, and also the correlation between FC and structural connectivity. So all these metrics that were used to index the depth of unconsciousness, they're moving in the other directions. They are recovering. So the interim conclusion is quite simple, that external perturbations tend to displace the brain towards conscious wakefulness along this one-dimensional manifold, but sometimes, consciousness is just too far, so you won't reach it. So this is a potential explanation of why it's so difficult to induce perturbations that will wake up the participants. So in conclusion, the original hypothesis we presented seems confirmed, at least to a certain extent, for these different brain states. but more exhaustive analysis of brain states perhaps is necessary for validation. So we would like to see if other brain states fall neatly, again, a one-dimensional continuum when they are encoded in this way. And also we would like to explore what happens in terms of perturbations, ideally using empirical data. So this is the team that worked with me on this project. Thank you very much for your attention.